This is the second episode in Python game development series, and in this one we are going to start creating classes and methods, and also we are going to implement more object-oriented programming stuff in order to have a game going on. We need to now start creating some cells to simulate the Minesweeper game. So that's going to take us an effort of creating elements dynamically. So there's going to be a lot of logic that we are going to deal with in order to make our window as dynamic as possible. So a lot to expect from this episode, and as usual, if you will enjoy this episode, please be sure to hit the like button and as well as subscribe to my channel so you will not miss the future episodes. Let's get started. Okay, so until this point, we know that we have a frame here, and we also have a frame that is here. Now, we said that around here we are going to write some information about the game, and here we will have the Minesweeper title like that, right? But what we want to do here in the center is actually developing the board, right? Each cell that a player is going to click on should be here, and here we should locate all of our cells. Now, creating hard-coded 36 cells or 49 cells, basically just a huge amount of cells, is going to be hard. So here's the exact location that we want to make our stuff a little bit more dynamic. We want to be able to go ahead and do a for loop that will go ahead and create those kind of cells dynamically. Now, we also want the behavior for each cell, the kind of a button behavior, so-called, because we want the ability to click on something and then next thing, something will happen in the game, right? We will see some information about that cell. So that is the exact time for creating a class that we can name it cell, because we know that for each cell we also like to give some attributes, like if the cell is mine or not, or if this is a cell that is already opened or it is closed. So that's exactly the time that it is a great idea thinking about creating a class that we could name cell, and we could create some instances of that later on. Now, just as a quick example, I'm going to delete that after I'm going to show you the basic example, but here's how you can create a button on a window using the tkinter library, right? So let's use a random variable like button1, and that will be equal to button like that. Now, this button is going to receive several arguments. Let's say that we want this inside our center frame, and we want to give the background color of blue, and let's give it a text. Sorry for missing the comma here. Let's give it a text like first button, and then what I'm going to do now is going to say button1.place. We will place it in the first pixel in x axis and y axis in the center frame. So it should be in the very top left position of that center frame, right? So if we were to go ahead and run this, then you can see that I have a button right there and it is clickable. Now we know that we want to abstract it with our custom class because we need to give that cell, so-called, some attributes as I described earlier. So that's why I want to create a cell class, and then we will also see how the button class is going to be involved within that cell class we will start developing. But let's actually go ahead and start working on this, right? So I just wanted to show you how to create a button before we go ahead and write some more code. So I will go here and create a cell Python file, right? And I will zoom in a bit so everyone can see, and I will use class cell. Now temporarily, I don't want to inherit from the button class, right? Because it is not quite correct to say that a cell is a kind of button. We know that we use inheritance to describe kinds of things, like dog is a kind of animal. So dog class should inherit from a class that is an animal class. But that is not exactly the case here, so I'm not doing that. And now that I created this class, let's go ahead and write the constructor of our class. Now, as we know, constructor is a method that is going to be called immediately once a class is being instantiated. Now I will receive temporarily here one parameter, which I'm also going to provide it a default value of false. And you can see that it is called isMine, right? And I'm going to say self.is_mine is equal to is_mine like the following. Alright, so now that we have this, let's see how we are going to use it in our code. So I will go to my main.py file and we'll scroll just above this comment here, run the window, and I will need to import the class for sure. So let's go ahead and use from cell, which is the file, import the cell class like that, right? And I'm just going to place it in that line so we will have a cleaner look. Now I'm going to go here and I'm just going to say c1 is equal to cell, and then I'm just going to leave it as it is because it has a default value of false. And now that I have this, then I can just go ahead and run it, and you can see that the instantiation is probably a good because we don't receive any errors. Now obviously we don't see any button here because we just created a custom class without relating it to the button class that comes from this tkinter library. So now this is exactly what we are going to do, right? We are going to go to our cell file and we are going to create a button instance that is going to belong to each cell object. So what that means? It means that this self is going to receive one more attribute that we could name it cell button object, something like that. And then we are going to assign it a button object, and that's how the relationship between the cell objects and the button object is going to be accomplished. So first things first, I'm going to close the game temporarily, and I'm going to go here and say from tkinter import, you know what, let's import just the button class. Let's not use a wildcard import here. And now I'm going to go ahead and say that this should be equal to none at first. And then what we're going to do now is going to create an instance method that will create this button for us, and I will assign it to self.cellButton object. Let's take a look how we are going to do that. So I'm going to say create button object, and we will receive self only for now, and we are going to say here button is equal to a button like that, and we are just instantiating an instance of that button class. Now currently we do not receive any additional parameters other than the self, which is mandatory in instance methods. So we need to be receiving at least one parameter that is quite important, which we can name it location, because we know that for each element that we'd like to create in our window, we should be passing in a piece of information that will make tkinter to understand where it should locate that element. So if we receive a parameter that is called location, then I can just pass in the location directly, and then whenever I call this method, I will refer to the actual center frame, which will be from the main.py. That's why I'm receiving here the location parameter, right? And just for a temporary example, let's give it also a random text like text like that, just as a beginner. And then I'm going to say that self.cellBTN object is going to be equal to the object of the button that I have just created. And that is going to be helpful because that will help me to later on customize this button once I assign this attribute into a button object. And you're gonna see just in a minute how that is going to be extremely helpful. So let's go ahead and split now vertically so we can understand what we have done here. So on the left side we have the cell file, and on the left side I'm going to work on my main.py file. So what I'm going to do now here is going to go ahead and say c1.createButtonObject, because I can allow myself to call that button, and then I have the ability to pass in the location because center frame is a variable that is accessible from the main.py file, right? So I can directly say center frame as a parameter, and then I can keep working with my button object thanks to the attribute assignment that I have done here, right? So I can go down and I can say c1.cellBTNObject.place like that, and I can say that I would like to place it in x equals to 0 and y equals to 0, just like we have done in the beginning of this episode. And now that I have done this, then it is a great time testing our code. So I'm going to run this application and you're gonna see that we are having that button. So that's a very fine start developing this application and spreading the code in different files so it will be more maintainable and more readable. Alright, so now that we have done this, then we need to understand that we are going to have some problems in the future if we will keep using that place method in order to place our elements. Now, in order to show you the problem that I'm talking about, I'm going to create here one more instance of the cell class that we came up with. So I'm going to say that C2 is equal to cell like the following, and then I'm going to say C2.create button object, and it's going to be center frame again. And then I want this cell just near the first cell, right? So I should be saying something like c2.cellButtonObject.place, and then we should know dynamically how much pixels we should jump right in order to place it exactly in the location that we want. But that's going to be a lot of headache and a lot of trouble always knowing the exact location that we want to pass, because for example, let's say that I will pass in x equals to 20 and y equals to 0 and run our game. Now you can see here that the right button looks like it is before the left button because we can almost not see the text on the left button here. So we can try to increase this amount of x to 40, something like that, and re-execute our game, and you can see that now it is much better. But when we want to deal around creating multiple elements dynamically, then maybe using the place method isn't the best option here. So we need to consider changing our placement method when we use tkinter when it comes to tens of elements that we want to create dynamically, and we can do this by changing our method from place to grid. Now what grid does, it takes the parent element, which is quite right there, and it turns the parent element into columns and rows. Now the beauty is it counts from 0 the columns and rows. So for example, if we want to place a button right there, then we can say that we'd like to grid that and then give it some values that will be considered as the column number and the row number. Let's see this in action, right? So it might be a little bit confusing to understand in the theory, but now that we will go ahead and code this, it will be easier to understand. So I'm going to delete everything from here and go back to PyCharm and actually go ahead and change the placement method from grid on both of those buttons here. So I'm going to go to my C1 and I'm going to say grid, and then I'm going to pass in here column equals to 0 and row equals to 0, like that. Now I'm going to grab those arguments and pass in the same, changing this method to grid as well, and then you're gonna see the difference when I will be saying here row equals to 1. And now if we were to go ahead and run our program, then you can see that we have a difference. This text here is used to be at column 0, row 0, but this one used to be placed at column 0, row 1, and that is the reason you see the second button under the first button. And if I was to change this to 0 and make that 1, meaning column equals to 1, then you're gonna see those buttons one near each other, which is perfect, and it will be helpful when we want to create tons of buttons in order to start preparing for the Minesweeper game. Alright, so now that we understood how the grid method works, then we are going to start creating those cells like we want in our Minesweeper game. Now that's something that we can achieve with a nested for loop. So let me show you how it is going to look like, so it will be easier to maintain in the future. And let's delete this first. So I'm going to start my first for loop and I'm going to say for x in range of 5, for example. Now range is just a function that is responsible to generate all the integers in the given range of numbers. If I was to only pass in here 5, then it will generate 0, 1, 2, 3 and 4 like that, right? So I'm going to go inside here and then I'm going to say for y in range of 5. So I'm basically achieving here the behavior of creating 25 buttons because I have a loop that iterates 5 times inside another loop that iterates as well 5 times. So now I can go inside of that and I can say that C is equal to cell So I'm instantiating an object of it, and then I can go ahead and say create btn object. And as the location, I will pass in center frame for sure. So now that we have created the button object, then I can access it with the property that we have created previously, which was cell btn object. And I can use the grid option, and then I can pass in column equals to y, and I can say row is equal to x, like that. And now let's see the result of that. So I'm going to run that, and you can see how beautiful it looks like, right? So we are already starting to see something similar to a Minesweeper game, and that's perfect. Now what we can do, instead of hard coding in the 5 on those for loops, we can actually allow ourselves to go to the settings file and write here a new setting that can look like grid size. And then we can decide that it is equal to any number we'd like to. I will say 6 just because this was the number that I showed in the beginning of this entire series as an example game. And then I'm going to go here and say settings dot grid size. Now if you remember, I import the entire settings file right there, right? So I can access the grid size variable. And I can also say here the same thing. And then I can just run our program again, and you can see how it looks like. So we have a 6 columns and rows like that, and that's just a great starter. Now before we go ahead, sorry about the confusion here. I think it will be better if we will say column equals to x and row equals to y. Because if we were to, for example, change this to 3 and not the settings.grid size, then it's going to be more accurate to say that we have 3 rows, right? 1, 2, and 3. So that's why I'm going to stick for those column equals to x and row equals to y, like the following. And then now I can just convert this back to settings.grid size and continue from here. Alright, so now that we totally understood this, then we probably want to also understand how we can assign events to our buttons. Now an event is basically a list of actions that you want to take once you click on a button. Now we said in the beginning of this entire series that we'd like to differentiate between the action that we are taking when we left click on a button or when we right click on a button, right? Because those are 2 different actions in a Minesweeper game. So that is going to be very cool designing this thing in the Minesweeper game. Giving the events for our buttons is actually a very fun part of our game. So let's see how we can do that. So I'm going to go to my cell.py file, and here's the exact location that we can start assigning some events to the buttons that we create. Because that's exactly the location that we create our button object. We can also go ahead and assign it an event. Now let's go ahead and write this. So when we want to assign an event to a button, then we want to work with a specific method that is called bind. So with bind, we can actually go ahead and say that we like to print something when we left click on a button. And let's see how we are going to do that. So we're gonna need to pass in 2 arguments. The first argument being the key that is clicked on the button, and as well as what is the function that you want to be executing once you click on whatever button you click at. So first things first, we want to say that we want to do something when we left click on a button. And the convention with the tkinter for passing in the left click is going to be something like the following. So I'm going to use the less than sign, and I'm going to say button capitalized -1 greater than sign. So button -1 is just a convention of saying left click. Button -3 is going to be right click, and we're gonna see this just in a second. And then we also like to say that we like to execute some function, right? That's gonna be the second argument of the bind method. So let's start with the most minimalistic function that we can come up with. So I'm going to create a method inside my cell class, which I'm going to be calling left click actions, like that. And that's gonna also receive self for sure. It's an instance method, and then it's only going to say I am left clicked. Just as a basic example, I'm going to leave it as it is. And now that we have done this, then I can easily pass in the reference for that method. So it's not going to be like left click actions and I'm going to call this method like that. Besides, I'm just going to give it the reference like the following. So pay attention that you are not calling this method, you are only passing the reference of that method. So now that we got this, then let's check it out and see if that is going to work for us. So I'm going to go here and make this a little bit bigger, and I'm going to try to click on one of those cells here. And you can see that we have an error. Now you can see that it says here left click actions takes one positional argument but two were given. Now that might be a familiar error that you maybe saw in my OOP series, but basically this means that this self-click actions tries to pass in two arguments when it tries to call the left click actions method. Now that means that this method needs to be receiving one more additional parameter in order to make this event assignment successfully. And that comes from just as a convention of Tkinter. It needs to be receiving one more parameter when you assign something to an event. It might be a little bit confusing, but that's the way that events are working in tkinter. So by convention, I'm only going to receive in an additional parameter that I'm going to call it event. Now this should be enough because Tkinter tries to pass in two arguments, so passing here another parameter here should be perfect. So I'm going to re-execute the program, and then I'm going to try to click on some buttons, and you can see that we have a great result here. For each button that I'm clicking, I'm receiving this text of I am left clicked, and that is perfect. Now I'd also like to add in here one more line which will be responsible to print in the info that comes to that event parameter, and you're gonna see that it is actually filled in with some information that tkinter passes in the background. So now let's again run our game, and if I was to click on something, then you can see that I received some info about what was the event that is occurred. So you can see that I have a button press event state equals to mod 1, just basically some metadata about the event that has been occurred in that moment. And you can also see that I received the values of x-axis and y-axis for the exact location that it was clicked. So that is just a great background information that you can go ahead and do something with it if you like to. And now you can clearly see why this bind method requires from us to receive one more parameter when we assign a function as a event that needs to be called. Now it might be a great idea to also prepare the bind method for our right clicks. So I'm going to minimize this console, and I'm just going to duplicate this line, and I'm going to say that we should be also binding the button -3. So this will stand for right click, and this will stand for left click. Now you might also want to try button -2 if button -3 doesn't work for you. Just for safety, if 3 doesn't work when you right click, try also button -2. If you have any further troubles, then let me know this in the comment section. Alright, so I'm going to say here right click actions, and obviously I'm going to go here and say def right click actions, and again I'm going to receive this event, and I'm just going to do the same, right? So at first I'm going to print the event, and I'm going to say I am right click, so we can differentiate between the two. And I'm going to again execute our game, and I know you can't see this, but I'm going to right click on that, and you can see that now we have the text in the console that is the exact same like the right click action. So that is great, and we were able to actually assign some events to all of our buttons dynamically. Alright, so I hope you had a great time in that episode. In the next episode, we are going to write the logic about a mine in a Minesweeper game. It's going to be a lot of methods and logic that we're gonna need to write in order to start seeing a real game going on. So if you enjoyed in this episode, please hit the like button and as well as subscribe to my channel, and I will see you in the third episode.